Dr. Neil Carman is the Clean Air Program Director for the Sierra Club, the Texas chapter of the Sierra Club. He's worked on environmental pollution issues in Texas for 37 years. He was involved with TCEQ enforcement cases at the agency, and he's observed firsthand for more than 3 decades how children and adults are harmed by pollution exposures in communities, and he's dedicated his life to pursuing protective public policies that decrease the damage to people and the environment from pollution. So he spent 12 years investigating industrial pollution sources for violations of state and federal laws, including refineries. And so without further ado, Dr. Neil Harmon.
Thank you very much. What you've heard from Judith and Hilton is about the sacrifice zones that exist in Texas. They're all over the place. They're in Corpus Christi, Port Arthur, Texas City. They call it Toxic City. You can go through the Houston Ship Channel. And what I found out when I worked for the state was very shocking. Because of my background in chemistry, I had too much of it. But when I started working in 1980, immediately I was near chemical plants and big refineries. And I could smell the chemicals, the sulfur chemicals, the benzene compounds, because I had worked with a lot of these things in the laboratory. So I was shocked at how bad it was smelling. And I was in minority neighborhoods in places like Big Spring, Texas, El Paso, Houston, Odessa, up in the Panhandle. And although I worked mainly in West Texas, what I saw on a daily basis was shocking to me. And I began to ask from the first week I worked in 1980, what can we do about these dirty plants, the refineries and the chemical plants? I was very concerned about the people living in these neighborhoods. And so put up the first slide. One of the first lies that you hear is that these plants are regulated. It's an absolute lie. They are not regulated. The permits are so flawed that after 12 years, when I left in 1992, I concluded that nearly 100% of the major permits issued by my agency to the big chemical plants and power plants and refineries were all flawed. I can only touch a little bit on them because it's very complicated science and regulation. Some of the criteria pollutants that are supposedly regulated include things like all these little particles. And you saw the slides, I think, that Judith put up of the smoking event. Well, there's a lot of visible particulates that are loaded with cancer-causing chemicals. And all it takes is one single lifetime exposure. You could be 5 years of age, you could be 10 or 15, and then 20, 30 years later you get cancer. There's no way today with our science of toxicology and medicine to prove that that exposure 15, 20, 30 years in your past caused your cancer. We can't do it yet. We're not there. But, and then there's a lot of invisible carcinogens like the benzene. And so there's many air toxics that these plants emit. In fact, what I realized going into these refineries and chemical plants on a daily basis is that they leak, belch, burp, and hiccup 24 hours a day. That's because they're loaded with tens of thousands of pieces of equipment, pumps, valves, flanges, connectors, compressors, and equipment that constantly leaks. Put up the next slide. Anyway, you see up there benzene fugitive leaks. So in a refinery and certain chemical plants where they have benzene that's 10% or more in the liquid stream, then they have to do testing, monitoring, but it's on a quarterly basis. I used to go into the refineries and watch them. They go around with a little handheld sniffer, and hey, they're leaking benzene all the time. But is it a legal leak or illegal? If it's above the speed limit, it's illegal, and they're supposed to tweak the valve, tweak the pump, whatever. And so these things, a refinery that's about 50,000 barrels a day could have anywhere from 10,000 up to 25,000 pieces of equipment that are leaking benzene around the clock. Now, they'll say, oh, it's just a little bit. I knew what I was smelling in these refineries, and I saw the guys go around with their little sniffers. These were calibrated instruments, and the thing was always moving. We never saw zero leaks. Doesn't exist. Okay, you'd have to have leakless pumps. Those are too expensive. They're not going to build a green refinery. It would cost billions of dollars. I've already helped people in Arizona and North Dakota stop the Arizona Clean Fuels Refinery. It wasn't a clean green refinery for several $billion. That's a dead permit. And the Mandan Refinery up in North Dakota that the Native American women opposed, but the men in the tribe wanted it. Anyway, these refineries are dirty facilities. They've gotten a little less polluting over time. The next slide. So there's flaws in the way the permitting is done. Because if you didn't have a flawed permit, it would be too expensive to build these plants. So the state allows for sacrifice zones. I mean, that's what Hilton and Judith are basically talking about. And I've been to these communities. I've been around into Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, California. I've been to refinery communities all over the country. It's the same thing. It's not just Texas. California's a little bit better. But the carcinogens are really nasty. There's also flaws in the monitoring. For example, the smoke you saw, they don't know how much smoke they're emitting. They couldn't tell you how much benzene's in the air. They can guess, but that's not good enough. There shouldn't be any carcinogens in the air if you want to be safe, if you want to protect human health. The way the agency did the complaint investigations, I saw the flaws. I wrote a lot of violations. Every violation I could write for 12 years. We were in lawsuits and enforcement actions from the first year I was in the agency. But still, you know, there's flaws in the enforcement process. I saw how a lot of the violations that were issued were not in the letters. They weren't in the enforcement penalties and all that. Next slide. Anyway, one of the things they could do is they could put in a flare gas recovery system. That's happening in a lot of big chemical plants and refineries to reduce the flaring. But it's, you know, these are $15 million units. I don't know if Raven's going to do that. Okay. Flaring is a big concern because that smoking flare incident you saw, that is a big problem because there's no monitoring. I mean, they say, well, we have a smoking flare. We got to call the TCQ. I took hundreds of those phone calls from these plants that they were having an upset. It's like going down the highway and you're doing 145 miles an hour and the trooper pulls you over and you say, well, officer, I had an upset. A bee flew into the car and my foot stuck to the accelerator. So these companies have a lot of loopholes in the law that are not enforced. The next slide. Anyway, so they're not going to know how much smoke they're emitting, even though you can measure it, but typically they're not required to. And the soot particles, go to the next slide. Like I said, the big problem is that you have things like benzene, okay? Benzene is a carcinogen. And then in the soot, you have polycyclic aromatic benzene compounds. These are super carcinogens like benzoalpha-pyrene. And so, you know, you don't want to admit any of this stuff, but yet they're allowed to. I mean, all the refineries in Texas have flares. They smoke. And the benzene can come out of the flare either through the stuff that's being flared from the exhaust or waste gases, or it can be created de novo, brand new. Just like you see the skydivers jumping out of an airplane and they're all separating. Those are the carbon atoms that are all separating, and then they come back together because the flare doesn't have enough oxygen or time or temperature or turbulence for it to completely burn to carbon dioxide and water. So you get benzene formed, and you get these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, all kinds of carcinogens formed. And Judith was making a very a powerful point about transgenerational effect. Yes, you can have somebody exposed at the age of 15 to a carcinogen. It might be passed on to their child, to their grandchild. There are transgenerational effects we know today. And so, you know, a child could get cancer from a grandmother or a mother's exposure years ago. but there's no way to really, prove that was the cause of it. The next slide. This is benzene. And so this is a big problem in the refineries. The only safe level of benzene is 0. If you're going to build a green refinery, it would be 0 emissions if they could do it. It would be too much money. Besides the super clean refinery, they'd have to build a dome over it. Nobody's going to do that. It's just too much money. Okay, so it's cheaper to allow sacrifice zones. And that's what I realized in the 1980s when I worked for the agency, and I did meet one person who was talking to me about this whole issue. And she said, Neil, do you realize that the reason they allow these plants to be so dirty is so that they save money, and they will sacrifice the lives of children and adults for the sake of money. And that's what this is all about. And Texas is big. We've got 26 oil refineries. We've got over 500 big chemical plants. And a lot of these have these things like benzene and other cancer-causing agents. There's also teratogens, which cause birth defects. And again, are you going to prove how a birth defect was caused by a chemical that Raven Petroleum emitted? No. We don't have this. The science won't be there maybe for another 20 to 30 years. Okay? So this is not going to be a really clean facility. I mean, they'd have to spend $1 billion or more, and it's going to be full of leaky equipment, just like the other refineries, because they've got all these pumps and valves and flanges and connectors, and they have full-time teams in these refineries and chemical plants where they have to do testing for benzene, and they go around all day long, and they're using these little calibrated sniffers, and every piece of equipment is leaking benzene. And occasionally, I know I was in the Shell refinery in Houston in the late 90s when they brought in a laser system with infrared light from the Sandia labs in New Mexico. And they pointed it up at a place where Shell didn't have to, by EPA or TCQ regs, go up and monitor for benzene. And guess what they found? 100,000 parts per million benzene, a 10% leak. Huge, huge compared to what they've typically found. They hadn't been required to monitor it because it was too high up, and it wasn't in the EPA rules. Huge loophole. And I asked the officials there, because I was on a EPA refinery task force, and I did ask EPA officials, are you going to change the Clean Air Act rules on refineries and require this kind of equipment to be tested for benzene? I think they did eventually. But anyway, so this, in a nutshell, is what you're really facing. And I wouldn't trust these people. You've already heard enough. We don't know who they are. But these plants are very dirty, and they emit a lot of toxic chemicals. We don't even know all the health effects that this stuff causes. And I'll just say in conclusion, the state doesn't want to know. They're not going to do health surveys before, during, or after this refinery is built because they don't want to know. The TCQ I worked for, they don't go out and do health surveys. The health department doesn't do health surveys. They don't want to know how much cancer is being caused. They don't want to know that they've created sacrifice zones. And I'll say one more thing. After I left the agency a few months in '92, in Austin, I went out and I had a meeting with some of the people that I all knew, the colleagues over me in compliance and enforcement, that I knew would talk to me privately. There were 4 of them. And I asked, why are there these sacrifice zones in these industrial areas in Texas? Because I had been all over the state while I was at the agency and after I left. And I said, the Texas Health and Safety Code, the Bible of the Clean Air Act in Texas, says everybody has a right to clean air. It's not enforced. And they told me straight on, Neil, these are industrial areas. People have a choice. They can either live there or they can move out. Industrial areas. I said, that's not in the Texas Health and Safety Code, that you can have an industrial area where you can pollute and you can kill people. I mean, it sounds hard to believe, but that's what these are. And it's not just Hilton and Judith and other people you talk to in these neighborhoods. they'll tell you the same thing. These are sacrifice zones. Thank you.